So with that said, let's start checking out some of these subsets. Now this is the distribution formed by the observed mortality database. And you have the body mass disparity index on the x-axis, all the way from -1, which are those small species killing much larger species, to 1, which are larger species killing smaller species. And there are a few things I think are very important when you're looking at this distribution. For one, it has a very long left tail. And so those species that are smaller than another tend to not be as prevalent. They don't kill larger species nearly as often as large species killing small species. But the other thing that I would like to take note of is that I've highlighted the hypothesized range of body values within this body mass disparity index that Donadio and Buskirk hypothesized about. And though this lower bound seems to hold out relatively well, where if you are 2 times the body mass of the killed species or smaller, it tends to be too great of a risk for you. But his hypothesized upper bound, where you're no longer killing species that are much smaller than you because they're no longer ecologically relevant, doesn't hold true. And in fact, the mode of this distribution is found for the histogram bin that comprises those body mass disparity index values between 0.9 and 1. So this means that the mode of this distribution consists of carnivores killing species in order of magnitude or larger or smaller than they are. And this is very contradictory to this original hypothesis that you're no longer bothering killing smaller species. And it seems that they're doing it quite a lot. Now, if you take this absorbed mortality data set and split it into those cases where a carnivore species is killing the adult of another carnivore species, and those cases where a carnivore species is killing a juvenile, you notice that the distribution formed by those juvenile killing relationships is almost completely homogeneous, which means that extremely small species will kill the young of extremely large species, and vice versa. And this body size constraint seems to mostly disappear when you're killing the young of another animal, which is, I think, basically what you would expect, because generally speaking, even if an animal is substantially larger than you as an adult, its offspring are still quite small and therefore much easier to kill. And this was found on the lower end with things like black-backed jackals killing the young of lions, which outweigh them many dozens of times, to the far end of this distribution with lions killing the cubs of servals, which are these small rodent-feeding cats, and everything in between. Now, if you look at the dietary data, you see the same general story, but even more significant at the upper end of this distribution. And once again, I've highlighted the hypothesized range of values within which Donadio and Buskirk thought that you'd be most likely to see killing relationships, and which you would no longer see killing relationships nearly as frequently above. And this modal peak between 0.9 and 1 is even greater in this data set, which suggests that by not examining dietary data, we're missing part of the picture of how intensively and how frequently a carnivore species will kill another one that's much smaller than it is. Now, a lot of this has been so far general hand-waving, and I wanted to be able to get a more quantitative understanding of whether or not these two distributions differ from each other. So I took subsets of this overall distribution, and what you see in the top are those species interactions that are only found in the dietary database, and they've not found through carcasses. And the bottom distribution are those species interactions that are only found in carcasses and have not been found through dietary data. And the overall story here is that though the mode of both distributions are the same, you tend to have a lot more lower values for those carcasses, for those species interactions that are only found in carcass data, and a lot fewer of those lower interactions for those species interactions that are found only in dietary data. And to be able to determine whether or not this was the case, I fit a variety of regression models using the scaled body mass disparity index as a response variable, and a covariate for which of these two databases given species interaction was found in. And I didn't include those interactions that are found in both databases because they're not terribly informative in terms of this analysis. And I also added a covariate for the family of the killer species, whether it was a felid, whether it was a canid, ursid, etc. And I incorporated a covariate for the family of the killed species. And to be able to compare some of these models, I constructed a series of nested models and performed likelihood ratio tests to determine the significance of a given covariate. And the basic story here is that a covariate that describes a family of the killer species was non-significant. A covariate that has a family of the killed species was non-significant. Whereas a covariate that included the data source relative to models only the intercept was significant. However, I wanted to be able to get regression parameters and more specifically coefficient values. So for the model that included only the data source, whether a species just occurs in the observed mortality data set or whether a species just occurs in the dietary data set, and the coefficient value was negative and was significant, indicating that those species that are found in the observed mortality data sets have significantly lower body mass disparity index values because both the killer species and the killed species tend to be closer together in body size than in the dietary data. However, there is a bit of a problem with just this model alone, and that is that this model doesn't incorporate the possibility of pseudo-replication. In that, for example, lions have 14 different pairwise species interactions that are only found in the observed mortality data set. And lions are larger than every species that they're sympatric with throughout their range. And as a consequence of this, almost certainly most of the values of the body mass disparity index from those species that they kill are going to be highly positive just because they're so big. And so to be able to determine whether or not pseudo-replication was affecting any of these inferences, I fit a model that had only the fixed effects of data source as well as a model that had the identity of the killer species as a random effect. And the general idea is if the coefficient values don't change with the incorporation of a random effect for species identity, then it's less likely that pseudo-replication is going to be altering your inferences. On the other hand, if the coefficient value were to change when adding a random effect for species identity, then your inferences are less strong and you might have to worry about it. So these are the two models that I constructed, and I should note that though in an ideal world I would have incorporated a beta distribution and random effects, at present there's no software that I know of that will allow you to fit both the best fitting distribution and random effects. So I used the second place model within the distributions that I showed you earlier. And so these are the results for a Gaussian distribution, one without random effects shown at the top and one with random effects shown at the bottom. And the general conclusion here is that especially within the ranges of the standard error values for both coefficients, there's no real evidence that adding a random effect appreciably changes the coefficient value for the covariate, and consequently pseudo-replication probably isn't isn't biasing the inferences I made earlier about the data sets. Now, another way that you can have bias between data sets is you can have species of smaller body families appearing more often within these data sets than species within the dietary data set than species of large body families. And you can also have a similar phenomenon with smaller bodied species interactions occurring more often in the dietary data set, where I predicted you would have more small bodied species than in the observed mortality data set. And so this histogram here shows you all of the different carnivore families that have been known to be killed by cats. However, I removed domestic species from this histogram because domestic dogs and cats have a near global distribution. And so showing how many cats killed those species would bias the overall histograms and associated analyses. And the top of these two histograms shows the number of species that are killed. So from each family, how many have been known to be killed by felids in the observed mortality data set and in the dietary data set. The bottom histogram shows you the number of species interactions. So you may have the same number of species, but just more cats are killing those species, or both may be the case, where you have more species for smaller bodied families in the dietary data set, and more species interactions involved in killing the species. So to be able to determine whether or not these two distributions are differ from each other, I performed a Fisher's exact test to determine whether or not the shapes of the histograms differ from each other. And I found that though the number of species themselves did not differ between data sets, the number of species interactions of those species did significantly differ, albeit at a weakly statistically significant value. And consequently, this basically suggests that you have more cats killing smaller carnivore species in dietary studies than you do in observed mortality studies. Now finally, the last of these factors that I wanted to examine was how competition affects these data sets. How many of these species interactions involve one competitor killing another, and how many of these species interactions involves a non-competitor killing a non-competitor. And you have these two distributions here. The top distribution shows the frequency of cases where an animal killed another carnivore that was not a competitor. So an animal that did not consume the same kinds of resources. Whereas the bottom of these two distributions showed cases where animals were competitors and killing each other. And once again, I think there's some interesting patterns here. And the first of these is that, unsurprisingly, the further you are away from the body mass of another animal species, the less likely you are to be feeding on the same kinds of food. But what I thought was particularly surprising is that, at least at a broad scale, where you're looking at these kinds of large dietary categories, this 5.4 times hypothesized upper end, above which it was thought that these animals are no longer competitively relevant, isn't actually an upper threshold for competitive species interactions. In that, at least at a broad scale, you can be even up to 10 times or larger the body mass of a species that you're killing and still feed on the same kinds of prey. And in those cases, every single one of these are cats killing mustelid species that are renowned for killing animals that are larger than they are. For example, mountain lions killing long-tailed weasels that both feed on snowshoe hare in a given area. Now, to be able to determine whether or not these two distributions differ and whether or not the presence of killing a competitor affected whether or not you killed it, I once again applied these beta distribution regression models. And the overall result is that, first of all, whether or not your competitor significantly changed the overall slope of the regression model. And I also incorporated a covariate for whether or not the killer species was social. So does sociality affect the overall body mass disparity index of those species that you're killing? And basically, the competition covariate came out significant, indicating that if you and the species you're killing are both competitors, your body mass disparity index of that killing relationship is going to tend to be much similar and closer together in value than if you're killing a non-competitor, which will tend to be much smaller than you are. However, once again, you run into the same issue of pseudo-replication affecting some of these inferences and ideas. And so, once again, I applied a fixed effects model that had the competition covariate and the sociality covariate, describing whether or not a killer species was social, and a model that included those two covariates and also a random effect. And the two things to note here is that the coefficient of the competition covariate, while slightly being reduced within the range